Society often celebrates intelligence in theory, yet fears it in practice. For while cleverness entertains, true depth unsettles. Schopenhauer saw this with unflinching clarity. The thinker who sees beyond illusion is not rewarded with applause, but often met with silence, suspicion, or exile. To think differently is to live differently, and that difference can feel like a fracture between self and world. Conformity is the unwritten law that binds communities together. It offers safety in sameness, comfort in shared illusions. But for the free thinker, such comfort is poison. The sharper the mind, the less easily it dissolves into the crowd. And so the very gift of intelligence becomes a sentence of solitude, for what is obvious to the thinker appears unsettling, perhaps even dangerous, to the many. Here lies the dilemma. To follow one's own vision is to risk estrangement. To surrender to conformity is to abandon one's authenticity. Schopenhauer argued that intelligence heightens not only perception, but also alienation, for it awakens us to truths most would rather keep hidden. Yet within that alienation lies a hidden possibility, that solitude can become the ground of strength and estrangement, the seed of freedom. In this journey, we will examine the paradox of intelligence and conformity, how society fears what it cannot control, how free thinkers are both cursed and liberated by their insight, and how the burden of awareness can be transformed into authorship of one's own life. The mind is a labyrinth. Let's walk its shadows together. To see clearly is rarely a blessing in the way most imagine. Clarity carries its own burden, a heaviness that settles upon the one who dares to perceive too much. Schopenhauer argued that intelligence magnifies awareness not only of beauty, but also of futility, of the restless machinery of desire, of the endless grasping that drives human beings forward, often without pause to ask where they are going. For the ordinary person, life's contradictions blur into the background, softened by distraction. But for the thinker who notices, who cannot help but notice, the contradictions sharpen into knives. You begin to see the patterns, the way conversations circle around emptiness, the way ambition masquerades as meaning, the way the crowd celebrates illusions as though they were truth. The more you see, the harder it becomes to unsee. And with each layer of clarity, another veil falls away, leaving you exposed to a reality that others neither acknowledge nor wish to face. This is the first weight of awareness, the isolation that comes not from physical distance, but from perception itself. Schopenhauer believed that intelligence deepens suffering because it expands the field of vision. To know more is to feel more. And what you feel is not only joy, but also despair, absurdity, the cruelty of chance. You recognize the fragility of human bonds, the hollowness of endless striving, the inevitability of decline. Where others find comfort in the routine of life, you perceive its impermanence. And so, what gives light also burns. Awareness both illuminates and scorches, carving the free thinker away from the herd. History remembers figures who bore this burden. Socrates, sentenced to death for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, was guilty only of exposing the fragility of accepted truths. Galileo, forced by the Catholic Church to recant lest being tortured to death, bore the weight of truths his society could not yet carry. Nietzsche, wandering in isolation, warned of a culture sleepwalking into nihilism. Each carried the mark of one who saw differently, and each paid the price of alienation. For society rarely forgives those who unravel its illusions too soon. This weight does not fall only upon the great philosophers. It falls upon you whenever you point out what others pretend not to see. In the silence after a conversation filled with empty words, in the unease of watching friends chase pleasures that leave them emptier still, in the ache of recognizing how little of life is lived deliberately. These are small fractures, but together they form a chasm between the thinker and the crowd. And yet, Schopenhauer did not see this burden as mere curse. He believed that within the pain of awareness lies the seed of wisdom. To suffer consciously, to perceive without retreat, is to earn a kind of authorship over one's own existence. For what you endure in solitude becomes the foundation of authenticity. The world may resist you, may laugh at you, may turn its face away, but in that turning, you discover yourself more clearly. Still, the temptation remains to dull the mind, to retreat into distraction, to hide in conformity. But every time you try, the clarity returns. You cannot unknow what you have seen. And so the thinker must decide, is the weight of awareness to be borne as a punishment or carried as a responsibility? Schopenhauer believed the latter, that the thinker is called not to escape the burden, but to transform it, to turn solitude into sanctuary and perception into creation. This is the paradox at the heart of intelligence. The very gift that estranges you from others can also connect you more deeply to life itself. For though you may walk alone, you walk awake. Though you may feel the heaviness of awareness, you also glimpse a freedom that the unthinking will never know. The burden of clarity is real, but so too is its power. And it is in carrying this weight, not in laying it down, that you begin to move from alienation toward authorship. If you're liking this video, please like and subscribe now. It helps the channel to grow. Thanks for your support. Every society has its myths of belonging. We are told that to be accepted is to be safe, that to fit is to be whole. Yet beneath this veneer lies a quiet hostility toward those who stand apart. Schopenhauer understood this well. The herd does not merely overlook the outsider, it fears him. For the presence of a free thinker is not neutral, it is disruptive. It shakes the fragile equilibrium of shared illusions. You have felt it, perhaps, in the subtle shifts of conversation when you speak too honestly, when your thoughts cut deeper than the polite surface allows. A sudden silence, a smile that conceals unease, a dismissal disguised as humor. These are the first defenses of the collective against the one who will not conform. The herd instinct is not rational, it is protective. Conformity is its shield, and deviation its enemy. Schopenhauer wrote that most people prefer the comfort of illusion to the pain of truth. To expose their illusions, then, is to become dangerous. The thinker who refuses to worship at the altar of convention does not merely dissent. He threatens the very scaffolding upon which ordinary life rests. This is why societies ridicule the visionary, exile the rebel, or at times destroy the prophet. The danger lies not in weapons, but in words, words that fracture the consensus upon which order depends. History is crowded with examples. Socrates drank the hemlock that ended his life because his questions unsettled the youth of Athens. Italian philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician Giordano Bruno was burned alive because his cosmos was too vast for the church to contain. Even Jesus Christ was crucified because his message undermined the hierarchies of his age. Society often cloaks its fear in the language of morality, heresy, or treason, but the root is the same. The outsider sees too much, and seeing too much threatens control. This fear extends beyond the dramatic punishments of history into the quieter exclusions of everyday life. The child who questions authority is scolded into silence. The worker who refuses to echo the group is isolated. The artist whose vision cuts against fashion is ignored until the world is ready, or until it has forgotten them. In each case, the message is clear. Difference must be neutralized, contained, or erased. And yet the irony is sharp. The very individual society resists are often those who expand its horizons. Without the outsider, culture stagnates. Without dissent, truth withers. Schopenhauer himself lived in obscurity for much of his life, dismissed by his contemporaries who clung to safer philosophies. Only later did the world realize the depth of what it had resisted. Such is often the fate of the free thinker. First mocked, then marginalized, and only after death, celebrated. But you need not wait a lifetime to see this pattern. You encounter it whenever your authenticity unsettles those around you. When your refusal to play the game of appearances makes others uneasy. When your refusal to chase what everyone else calls success provokes suspicion. The herd does not understand why you resist its path, and so it invents reasons: arrogance, rebellion, eccentricity. Anything but the truth, that your difference reveals their dependency on illusion. The fear of the outsider is, at its root, the fear of freedom. Do you agree with Schopenhauer that society resists free thinkers because it fears freedom itself? Or do you see it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. To see someone living by their own vision is to be reminded of one's own chains. The conformist resents not the rebel's difference, but the mirror it holds up. For in that reflection, they see the possibility of a life unbound, and that possibility terrifies more than oppression itself. Better to mock the free thinker than to risk becoming one. Schopenhauer insisted that the thinker must not expect applause, for to live authentically is to live in tension with the crowd. Yet this tension is not merely destructive, it is also the birthplace of transformation. For the outsider, though resisted, carries within them the seeds of renewal. Society resists them because it secretly needs them. And though it may cast stones today, it often builds monuments tomorrow. The question is whether you, the thinker, can endure the resistance long enough to see the arc bend. Whether you can walk as the outsider without surrendering to bitterness or despair. For society's fear will not vanish. It will always guard itself against those who break its spell. But if you accept this fear as the measure of your difference, then what once felt like exile may begin to reveal itself as freedom. To live as a free thinker is to inhabit a peculiar kind of silence. It is not merely the absence of voices around you, but the absence of resonance within them. Schopenhauer wrote that solitude is the natural home of the intelligent. For the more one perceives, the more estranged one becomes from the noise of the crowd. This estrangement is not always chosen. It is the consequence of vision. The sharper your perception, the less you can rest in the distractions that sustain others. Loneliness begins not when you are alone, but when you are surrounded and unseen. Have you ever felt unseen even when surrounded by people? Share your story in the comments. Your experience with loneliness may be the reflection another thinker needs. You can be in a crowded room and feel the distance like a vast chasm. Friends chatter about trivialities. Colleagues cling to shallow ambitions. Family repeats the same patterns generation after generation. You watch, you listen, and you notice what others overlook. Yet the very act of noticing sets you apart. The silence grows, not because you withhold, but because what you might say cannot be received. Schopenhauer knew this intimately. His works were ignored for much of his life. He wandered through years of obscurity, often dismissed while Hegel's fashionable philosophy reigned. His solitude was not romantic, it was heavy, and yet within it, he found space to create. For the thinker, loneliness is both poison and medicine. It corrodes when resisted, but it strengthens when embraced. In solitude, the thinker is free to dwell in ideas without distortion, to commune with the eternal rather than the temporary. You may feel this paradox in your own life. The ache of being misunderstood, the longing for someone to truly meet your depth. At times, it feels unbearable, as though your difference were a wound. Yet solitude can also transform into sanctuary. In the quiet, you hear your own voice more clearly. In the absence of applause, you discover the integrity of your path. What feels like exile can become authorship if you allow loneliness to ripen into self-possession. Consider the artist who paints in obscurity, the writer whose notebooks remain unread, the philosopher whose words echo only in their own study. Each may feel forgotten, yet each is cultivating something beyond the reach of the crowd. Loneliness, when endured, becomes the soil in which creation grows. For it is often in isolation that the deepest insights take form, insights too fragile to survive in the noise of conformity. But this path is not without danger. Prolonged solitude can harden into bitterness, detachment, or despair. The thinker must learn to balance silence with expression, solitude with occasional communion. Schopenhauer himself found reprieve in art and music, which he believed offered a rare escape from the tyranny of the will. Beauty became a companion, reminding him that solitude need not be sterile. It can be filled with meaning, even joy, if one knows where to look. Your own loneliness, then, is not a verdict, but a question. What will you do with the silence that surrounds you? Will it hollow you out, or will it deepen you? The world may never understand your full depth, but must it? Perhaps the measure of your life is not whether you are fully seen, but whether you have seen fully. Loneliness may remain, but within it you can build a dialogue with truth, a companionship with clarity itself. And history suggests that such loneliness is not wasted. Many thinkers endured years of obscurity only to shape generations long after their deaths. Kierkegaard published books few read in his lifetime, only to be hailed later as a prophet of existential truth. Emily Dickinson filled her solitude with poems that revealed the inner landscapes of human experience, though the world saw almost none of them until she was gone. Their isolation was not empty. It became a crucible where authenticity took form. In time, the very solitude that once felt like exile may reveal itself as freedom. For when you no longer depend on the crowd for validation, you discover an independence that cannot be taken from you. Schopenhauer argued that true dignity arises in this independence, that the thinker who accepts loneliness is no longer enslaved by the need to belong. What begins as isolation becomes sovereignty. Thus, the loneliness of the thinker is not the end of the story, but its turning point. For only by facing solitude without flinching can you begin to transform it into strength. And in that transformation, you cease to be merely alienated, you become free. Alienation is the shadow that follows intelligence. The more clearly you see, the more estranged you become from the rhythms of conformity. Yet, in Schopenhauer's philosophy, alienation was never the final word. It was the crucible, the necessary passage through which the free thinker must walk. For if awareness isolates you, it can also liberate you, provided you learn to carry the weight of solitude without collapsing beneath it. Schopenhauer believed that life is governed by the blind striving of the will, an endless hunger that drives human beings to chase satisfaction, only to be left unfulfilled. The conformist clings to this cycle, surrendering to its momentum. But the thinker, awakened by alienation, begins to step back from the current. To endure estrangement is to begin loosening the grip of the will. In that loosening, space appears, a space in which beauty, wisdom, and authenticity can emerge. This transformation does not happen suddenly. It unfolds in small acts of refusal. Refusing to measure yourself by the shallow standards of the crowd. Refusing to bury your depth beneath distractions. Refusing to betray your own perception for the comfort of belonging. Each refusal deepens the solitude, but it also deepens your sovereignty. The price of freedom, Schopenhauer suggested, is often paid in isolation. But it is precisely in that isolation that you begin to taste the first fruits of freedom. You see this pattern across history. The mystics who left society behind to wander deserts and forests. The philosophers who endured exile rather than silence their thought. The artists who created against the grain of fashion, knowing their work would be misunderstood. Their alienation was not a retreat from life, but an entry into a deeper dialogue with it. For when you no longer live to be accepted, you begin to live more fully aligned with truth. Alienation also reshapes how you perceive suffering. For the conformist, suffering is merely an obstacle, something to be concealed or avoided. But the free thinker, stripped of illusions, learns to face suffering as a teacher. Schopenhauer insisted that pain, far from being meaningless, sharpens perception and deepens compassion. To suffer consciously is to turn what destroys others into a source of insight. Alienation, then, is not only about separation from the crowd. It is also about entering into a more honest relationship with existence itself. This shift marks the transition from alienation as curse to alienation as power. At first, estrangement feels like exile. You feel abandoned by the world, unseen by those around you. But as you learn to inhabit it, the solitude becomes a kind of fortress. In the quiet, you build resilience. In the stillness, you cultivate perspective. In the absence of applause, you discover a strength that does not depend on recognition. What once felt like a wound becomes a discipline. Psychology confirms what Schopenhauer intuited. Those who can endure solitude without collapsing into despair often develop stronger inner resources. They rely less on external validation and more on their own clarity of thought and depth of feeling. Alienation, paradoxically, becomes the training ground for freedom. For it forces you to face yourself without distraction, to confront your fears, and to build an identity not borrowed from the crowd, but authored from within. Modern life, with its constant noise and demand for conformity, makes this transformation even more urgent. Never before have we been so surrounded by distractions designed to dissolve solitude. Social media, endless entertainment, the pressure to broadcast rather than reflect. To step aside, to choose estrangement from the endless scroll of conformity, is to reclaim a piece of freedom that the modern world seems determined to erase. In this context, alienation is not a curse to escape, but a necessity to embrace. Schopenhauer himself endured this paradox. Overlooked in his own time, mocked for his pessimism, he built his philosophy in the silence of rejection. Yet in that silence, he wrote works that continue to resonate centuries later. His alienation became authorship. His estrangement became legacy. He showed that freedom is not found in acceptance by the many, but in fidelity to one's own vision. And so the path of the free thinker is not merely to endure alienation, but to transmute it, to transform solitude into sanctuary, to transform suffering into authorship, to transform rejection into freedom. This is not the easy freedom of doing whatever you please, nor the shallow freedom of rejecting rules for rebellion's sake. It is the deeper freedom of living authentically, of refusing to betray what you see, even when the world turns away. The final paradox is this: the more you accept your alienation, the less it enslaves you. When you stop begging society for recognition, you discover that you are freer than those who belong. For the crowd is bound by its own illusions, its own compulsions, its own need to conform. But you, by standing apart, have already stepped beyond those chains. Alienation has become not your prison, but your passage into freedom. Intelligence has always walked a razor's edge, admired from afar, resisted up close. Schopenhauer revealed that to think deeply is to confront a paradox. The very clarity that liberates you from illusion also severs you from belonging. Awareness isolates, society resists, and loneliness presses in. Yet these burdens are not the end of the story. They are the forge. Alienation becomes the crucible where freedom takes shape. To refuse conformity is to risk exile, but it is also to inherit authorship of your own life. Solitude ceases to be emptiness when it is filled with vision. Suffering ceases to be meaningless when it sharpens compassion and clarity. The free thinker, though estranged, walks closer to truth than those who dissolve into the crowd. The choice remains yours, to dull your mind for the comfort of belonging, or to carry the weight of awareness and stand apart, to live hidden within conformity, or to embrace the paradox of intelligence, the curse of solitude, and the freedom that only solitude can bring. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. Until next time, may you carry the solitude of the thinker not as exile, but as strength. May your estrangement become authorship, your silence become clarity, and your burden of awareness unfold into freedom.